A prisoner of war is a non-combatant, whether a military member, an irregular military fighter, or a civilian, who is held captive by a belligerent power during or immediately after an armed conflict. The earliest recorded usage of the phrase, prisoner of war, dates back to 1610. Belligerents hold prisoners of war in custody for a range of legitimate and illegitimate reasons, such as isolating them from the enemy combatants still in the field, demonstrating military victory, punishing them, prosecuting them for war crimes, exploiting them for their labor, recruiting or even conscripting them as their own combatants, collecting military and political intelligence from them, or indoctrinating them in new political or religious beliefs. For most of human history, depending on the culture of the victors, enemy combatants on the losing side in a battle who had surrendered and been taken as prisoners of war could expect to be either slaughtered or enslaved. Early Roman gladiators could be prisoners of war, categorized according to their ethnic roots as Samnites, Thracians, and Gauls. Homer's Iliad describes Greek and Trojan soldiers offering rewards of wealth to opposing forces who have defeated them on the battlefield in exchange for mercy. But their offers are not always accepted. See Lycaon for example. Typically, victors made little distinction between enemy combatants and enemy civilians, although they were more likely to spare women and children. Sometimes the purpose of a battle, if not of a war, was to capture women, a practice known as rapture. The rape of the Sabines involved, according to tradition, a large mass abduction by the founders of Rome. Typically women had no rights, and were held legally as chattels. In the 4th century AD, Bishop Acacius of Amida, touched by the plight of Persian prisoners captured in a recent war with the Roman Empire, who were held in his town under appalling conditions and destined for a life of slavery, took the initiative in ransoming them by selling his church's precious gold and silver vessels and letting them return to their country. For this he was eventually canonized. According to legend, during Childrec's siege and blockade of Paris in 464, the nun Genevieve pleaded with the Frankish king for the welfare of prisoners of war and met with a favorable response. Later, Clovis I liberated captives after Genevieve urged him to do so. King Henry V's English army killed many French prisoners of war after the Battle of Agincourt in 1415. This was done in retaliation for the French killing of the boys and other non-combatants handling the baggage and equipment of the army, and because the French were attacking again and Henry was afraid that they would break through and free the prisoners to fight again. In the later Middle Ages, a number of religious wars aimed to not only defeat but also to eliminate enemies. Authorities in Christian Europe often considered the extermination of heretics and heathens desirable. Examples of such wars include the 13th century Albigensian Crusade in Languedoc and the Northern Crusades in the Baltic region. When asked by a crusader how to distinguish between the Catholics and Cathars following the projected capture of the city of Béziers, the papal legate Arnaud Amalric allegedly replied, "Kill them all. God will know his own." Likewise, the inhabitants of conquered cities were frequently massacred during Christians' crusades against Muslims in the 11th and 12th centuries. Noblemen could hope to be ransomed. Their families would have to send to their captors large sums of wealth commensurate with the social status of the captive. Feudal Japan had no custom of ransoming prisoners of war, who could expect for the most part summary execution. In the 13th century, the expanding Mongol Empire famously distinguished between cities or towns that surrendered and those that resisted. In terms, on the Oxus, all the people, both men and women, were driven out onto the plain, and divided in accordance with their usual custom. Then they were all slain. The Aztecs warred constantly with neighboring tribes and groups, aiming to collect live prisoners for sacrifice. For the reconsecration of Great Pyramid of Tenochtitlan in 1487, between 10,000 and 80,400 persons were sacrificed. During the early Muslim conquests of 622 to 750, Muslims routinely captured large numbers of prisoners. Aside from those who converted, Most were ransomed or enslaved. Christians captured during the Crusades were usually either killed or sold into slavery if they could not pay a ransom. During his lifetime, Muhammad made it the responsibility of the Islamic government to provide food and clothing on a reasonable basis to captives, regardless of their religion. However, if the prisoners were in the custody of a person, then the responsibility was on the individual. The freeing of prisoners was highly recommended as a charitable act. On certain occasions where Muhammad felt